Hi, everyone. Today I'm talking to a brilliant, incredible individual whom I'm proud to consider a friend, a mentor. So when I joined Google back in 2011, there was a mandatory training for all new Googlers, and he was one of the trainers. He was also one of the people that I remember thinking, wow, that is what you would consider a typical Googler in the most positive way in terms of googliness, being a good person, thinking about what is the right thing to do for the humanities, solving big problems, brilliant mind. And I'm grateful that we managed to reconnect through this work. In the past decade, he's been dedicating his time helping companies and helping the fast evolving technology industry to be more ethical. And so this conversation is very timely and relevant to the zeitgeist and to the mission of this podcast, which is essentially democratizing the knowledge of what's real and what's sort of fluff. How does technology rely on us, and what does it reveal about who we are? So how does it mirror and shape and rewrite human culture and human experience? To help me unpack this, I'm joined by brilliant Angelo Paolillo. He's an ethical digital strategist. He's a developer and educator with more than 20 years of experiences in places like IBM, Google, LinkedIn. Angelo is one of those people who do not only understand the machinery of big tech, but also approaches it with genuine humanity. His work spans everything from accessibility, learning design, to data-driven coaching programs and ethical AI strategy. And Angelo founded his own company focused on building technology with integrity. Angelo, I am so excited. Let's dig in.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be with you today.
So let's start with the first exploration as we previously talked about the human behind the machine. And so perhaps let's start with the human and then unpack what goes on behind this code. So you worked on everything from building semantic databases to designing data-driven learning programs and AI systems. And it gives insider view of how data is made and who actually makes the data. So my first question is, your work has always centered around empowering people through access to knowledge and education. How do you see this human element shaping the data itself? And then adjacent to this question, what can we learn when we look at the invisible labor? People labeling data, moderating content, clearing up the messy edges of the internet.
Thank you. That's a great question. That's a great topic to start with. There's a lot to think about, really. I believe we're becoming more and more familiar with concepts like data bias or starting understanding, at least some of us do, a little bit more about what's behind what we call today artificial intelligence. I'll take a very small step back by thinking, if you consider internet, for some people and in some countries, a social network like Facebook is a synonym of internet because people access the internet through that social network. It may be Facebook, it may be another. Or the World Wide Web, and we know internet as the web, or maybe the previous generation does, because we were using websites, and we may not be familiar with Usenet, Telnet, the Usenet groups, or internet relay chats, but we associate internet with the World Wide Web, or some people might associate it with social networks. Now, what is artificial intelligence? Mostly we refer to LLMs as AI in general. So we kind of have this overlap as, well, for us, artificial intelligence is ChatGPT or Google Gemini or Grok or Claude, Anthropic, or Llama with Meta, you name it. But some LLMs, some large language models, and we think that's artificial intelligence. But in general, artificial intelligence is much larger than that. So now we'll start referring to LLMs, so what we generally call AI today, but we can expand that beyond what LLMs are. In general, whether it's LLMs or other forms or parts of artificial intelligence, we rely on data anyway. And data is at the very core of what the artificial intelligence can do for us. And what we have is that, as I said, we're becoming more familiar with it. This data can be skewed somehow There, you receive responses from AI that are very much conditioned by how this data is formed and how it may be skewed. So you may have a data bias where the problem is with the data itself. For example, you may have trained a certain skin tone with image training, and when you go ahead and generate images with other skin tones, the results may not be as good because it's biased and skewed towards a certain ethical group, for example, rather than another. So you may notice, wait a second, this is somehow directed towards a certain direction. You may have some bias in the way this data is processed. So that would be an algorithmic bias, as in LLMs, for example, but many artificial intelligence algorithms, they will have different weights. So they will process data, will give more importance to certain things and less importance to other, and that will affect the output of the response. So that would be an algorithmic bias. And then what you mentioned, which is also touching the way labor is incorporated in this, is the human bias. Some form of human bias on the way data is being created as well. So if you think, for example, you've been training a certain model on 1,000,000 books, whatever was written in those books and was written by humans has been influencing the model. So there's already some data mediated human bias there. So the data is biased because you've been selecting certain data for training the model, but also the content, for example, the content of books that be used for training the model is biased by the opinions and the views of the people that have been writing that text. But then in general, as human behavior, we refer to the human bias, we refer to anything that has been added by humans that were classifying the data, they were reviewing, they were labeling the data, and they were telling the machines, oh, this is what it means. And there's a direct influence there where there's a human bias. You mentioned labor, so I think it's important to remember that behind artificial intelligence, there's a lot of human activity. And when you use an app for food delivery, for example, we tend to forget that there's a whole chain of events behind that food delivery. There's a processing food and cooking, and somebody that physically has been picking up their food and bringing it to you. But we may have this idea of this such a mediated technology mediated experience where we go ahead, browse an app, click, and boom, there's food at our door. And we tend to have less visibility over all the human activity beyond that simple ordering food operation.
Yeah.
And the same happens with AI, right? So I think it's important to remember there's a lot of human activity behind it. Yeah. And some of this labor can generate ethical questions because there's massive labor that can be reflective of low wage labor in different countries with hostile conditions. It raises ethical questions, and there's any training of data that where users don't even know that they're training models, and there's raises other ethical questions.
So human data by default is biased. So human data equals bias. And then the other consideration, and I really like the comparison with the food delivery process. So we see the final outcome, but there's this whole process behind it shaped by humans with different steps and stages. And so basically what you're saying is that because human data is already inherently biased, we have to deal with some ethical considerations there. People who are shaping the narrative have certain bias, certain angles that they view the world from, and that is limiting. And so that is an ethical consideration. Another ethical consideration is the process itself. So for example, how it's created, who is working on training the models, are they even aware of the broader context? And so that's another consideration. I think we tend to talk about AI like this all-knowing oracle, but in reality, it's built by people with all of our blind spots. How do we move past the myth that AI is something almost divine or all-knowing and start acknowledging this very human fingerprints all over it?
I think one way is, when we were kids, we were dismantling telephones to go and try and see how did they work and how did they look from the inside. And you may not go as far as analyzing in depth every single AI model that is thrown at you, but I think curiosity and generally trying to understand a little bit more of what's behind the technology is definitely a great defense mechanism. I want to reconnect for a second to the principle that you were mentioning earlier, where all data, all human production is biased. I'm not sure if we should use the bias word in every situation, but definitely we all have a point of view and we all have an opinion. So it will be partial because of the way we've been receiving information, the way we've been processing, our emotions attached to it, our views of the world. There's definitely a point of view. And whether that could be called a significant bias or not, it really depends on the situations. What we try to do, we try to balance it out. We try to be as objective as possible, welcoming as many point of views as possible. And it certainly becomes bias where things get skewed and directed somewhere, whether it's unconscious or whether it's even malicious or manipulative behavior. But there's some opinions that go beyond being genuine opinions, but they're actually things that are said and written with the exact purpose of directing people's behavior or people's ideas toward a certain direction. It has been happening throughout human history in any form of communication and content production. Why should it then happen with AI models too? So we need to be mindful and careful about it. And now this is partially an answer to your question where, wait a second, let's be attentive to what is happening and let's try to understand what is going on. But all I can add is try to be mindful of what the responses of the AI are, and whether or not there's anything left out, whether there's language that is showing that there's a certain point of view or opinion that is prioritized over the others, whether there are elements that we need to train ourselves in recognizing, hey, this sounds like a very culturally influenced opinion, and I need to research a little bit more. The same way we multiple newspapers, and when we try to get a sense of what is going on, we should at least read multiple news sources. So checking those sources, checking the consistency of the responses, checking how those responses may be influenced heavily by certain point of views are definitely good habits to develop when we're using LLMs, what we're referring to as AI now. And again, maybe later we can expand a little beyond LLMs, which again, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, LLMs are any model like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, right? So they're creating text and they're interpreting your language, your textual questions.
So this actually brings us to something that I find very fascinating. AI is a kind of cultural map maker. So you mentioned that you work with organizations that value human dignity, and long-term trust feels especially relevant here. So technology and AI systems in particular are trained in our culture, and in doing so, they reflect and sometimes exaggerate our collective values. So my first question to you is, from your experience helping companies build ethical digital strategies, how do you see AI acting as this cultural map maker? Do you see it mirroring who we are? Does it sometimes distort that reflection? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And using, I like the word is cultural map maker, because then, we started from the data bias. So how we've been influencing culturally the AI models. But then the AI models are responding to us in a way that maybe there's an algorithmic bias there. Maybe there are, some other reasons that will also shape our behavior and our cultural beliefs. They will have an influence. So it becomes a cybernetic loop where we're providing some information to the AI. The AI is telling us something back, and it's influencing culturally and our behavior as well. And so most models will tend to please the person that is interacting with them. So trying to respond in a way that is culturally aligned. There are some studies. I know there's a study that has been aligning the models with the World Cultural Value Map, and has been finding out that most major models will tend to respond in a Western white type of cultural framework, leaving out a lot of different points of views. There's an MIT Sloan School study that has been analyzing some aspects of cognitive activity and cultural-based activity. And they were, for example, prompting the models with different languages, such as English and Chinese. And the responses that they were getting, they were reflective of cultural components. So when asked, for example, to create, if I remember that right, it was an advertising campaign for an insurance company, hypothetical advertising campaign for an insurance company, and even the responses will slightly change. If the question was asked in English, they will have something like, to protect you, reflecting a sort of individual kind of oriented culture. And when it comes to the same question asked in Chinese, you will get a response such as, "will protect your family," because there's a lot more importance on, family ties, social relationships
Yeah.
in the Chinese culture. But that alone is showing how there's a cultural influence in the response that the AI has been giving you. Where does that come from? Could that be because that's the kind of input they got from material written in Chinese versus material written in English? That would be a data bias. But is that because of the weights that they've been acquiring the models from English and Chinese? That would be an algorithmic bias. Is that because it matches the language? There's different sources for that bias, but that happens. It's a cultural mediated bias, right? It's trying to align to your cultural views, and it's absolutely impossible to be completely detached from the cultural perspective. But we need to be mindful as, wait a second, I'm not talking to a machine that is neutral. It's a machine that is learning from us and is returning something to us, and we need to pay attention. And for example, one technique that is often used to try and gather different points of views, it will be to prompt the machine, asking the model, can you reply now as somebody from China, somebody from the US, a white female, an African American man, trying to gather the same responses from different point of view, and seeing how those cultural influences may be introduced back in the machine responses, in the AI model responses.
I wonder if, because language actually shapes our collective culture and our awareness, the way we think about things also shapes our language. But then in turn, as we're social beings, as we are socializing the new human beings, the children, they get absorbed into that collective consciousness that again is created by languages. That's why I'm always fascinated to speak to multilingual people. As a multilingual person myself, I've experienced almost like colliding concepts and perspectives. I think LLMs as a way of a language expression, or the product of language essentially, will have those sort of loopholes of limiting concepts, simply because it's shaped by the language, which in itself is a social construct. My following question is related to something that a famous anthropologist, Gregory Bateson, said. He was warning us about confusing the map with the territory. And so, in other words, mistaking our representations of reality for reality itself. How do you see that playing out with AI right now? And are we starting to treat the AI map, sort of the outputs and the simulations, as the territory itself?
That is a wonderful, wonderful question, and it connects with the bias as well, the cultural mapping and the bias. So because we're talking about cultural mapping, you're quoting Bateson on the map is the territory versus the map is not the territory, and that is essential. So of course we're confusing the map with the territory, and perhaps we shouldn't. But then what Bateson adds to it is maybe the map is the territory provocatively, as in, for what we need, that's perfect for our scope anyway. So this all starts with the Korsbisky conversation around the map is not the territory. So the idea where we draw a map of our reality, and even just because the reality, we mentioned that earlier, is mediated by our senses, that alone is already a reason for us not to be able to fully see and understand and perceive reality. So we're mapping the territory in a way that necessarily we're leaving something out. For instance, I don't know, if you draw a tree map, it's not necessarily counting the number of trees that you will find along the road. It's really just mapping the road so that you can drive from point A to B. And that map is there for a reason, for giving you a chance to reach point B from point A. So all that matters really is that road, right? So right now, me and you, we're talking, and our viewers are viewing, the listeners are listening, and all around us, there will be ultrasound that we cannot perceive, or there will be infrared light that we cannot see. So obviously, that is not part of our map, but it is there. If we put a machine that is capable of detecting infrared wavelengths, we will detect them, but we can't see them. So definitely, even just because of this sensorial limitation, the map is never the territory. That understanding, whether it's a language mapping, whether it's, like we're creating this cultural representation of reality, that Korsbisky point of view where, wait a second, the map is not the territory, is perfectly valid and definitely needs to be understood. Then Bateson picks it up again, going like, yeah, the map is not the territory. And at the same time, the map is, if we're drawing a map for a certain scope. So for instance, in the ethnical research, Bateson wrote, if we go to a certain population and they have the belief that the sneezing is caused by evil spirits that are coming out of your nose and that will enter other people's nose, that will cause people to put some distance between one another when they're sneezing and when they got a cold, because they may be thinking, oh, wait a second, I need to step, away or stay like, I don't know, like 2-3 meters away so that the spirit don't get into my nose. And for the purpose of not creating a spreading of that disease, so making sure that people don't catch a cold, for that purpose, it's absolutely relevant whether you know that the cold is caused by germs, viruses, whatever, or whether you believe there are spirits, because the end result will be the same. You will keep that distance. That cultural mapping of reality, even when it's completely incorrect, it serves a certain scope. That's where Bateson comes in and goes like, well, the map is not the territory, and maybe the map is the territory, because we're achieving that results that we set ourselves for, and we don't need anything else. So if we need a road map and a street map, and it's mapping that road effectively for us to go from point A to B, but it doesn't really count how many rocks, how many trees are along that road, aside the road. It doesn't really matter for our scope. But then again, with AI, there's a bit of a risk, because the AI is going to serve you for a certain scope. It will try to draw conclusions based on the relationship between different elements, establishing a correlation, but without necessarily understanding why certain things happen, as long as it works. And that kind of mapping may not be completely usable. Like, it will cause us some issues along the way. It might serve you for that specific scope. But while you're driving from point A to B and you don't really care about the number of trees along the road, there may be things that should be mapped and should be part of that. They shouldn't be included for ethical reasons, for balancing out biases, etc. And as long as we reach our target, we start not caring about that.
Yeah.
But if we care about the environment, maybe knowing that in the past 30 years the trees along the road have completely disappeared, it's an important information. And when we start drawing maps one on top of the other with specific purposes, and we stop looking at other things around that should fall into that map, we should be aware of that part of the territory, because it leads to other much dangerous consequences. That's something to start caring about, start thinking about.
Yeah, what I started thinking about when you were talking, like the different signals that we might be sort of putting together as then the social construct, and then going back to the mapping, but that's our social and cultural mapping that serves a specific purpose. But what I kept thinking about is, what about the fringe cases? For example, what's coming out of your nose is not necessarily related to the most common viral or bacterial issues, but it's some kind of a deeper issue that needs to be investigated. But because there is less awareness of that, because that's a gray area, sort of a fringe case, it would get ignored. And so in cases like that, it becomes a bit dangerous to operate with a certain sort of blind spots, or like in a certain very limiting way, because then, to your point, when it comes to environment, you may miss essential signals that you're just not including because that's not in scope for your current social and cultural construct. And that goes back to the design integrity. It's like, why are we designing certain solutions, right? When it comes to technology, even in ancient times, are you building the fire so that people can be warm? Or are you building the fire so that you can win the new turf by scaring other tribes off? Like, what's the purpose of that design?
There are some things that might be important beyond the scope of the mapping, and we try to pay attention to that. But there will be also certain things that might fall into achieving that objective and that we have not anticipated. For example, if we think, again, the sneezing example, right? If the objective is, let's avoid the spreading of the disease, and we think all we need to do in order to avoid that spreading of the disease is to keep people at a certain distance. So let's make sure that there's like 2-3 meters in between. So knowing that there's a virus that is airborne will be perfect for achieving this objective. It will be the cause and effect, and it will give you people, it would influence that behavior, and they will go, oh, we know this virus is airborne, and let's put a certain distance, right? And in that case, Bateson is absolutely right. Thinking that there are floating spirits in the air will serve that scope very well. But if, for example, we ignored, maybe we were not aware of that we can also get that virus by touching a contaminated surface and then putting the hand, close to our nose, then the spirit's narrative doesn't work anymore. So by not having the right knowledge and the right causation link, it only partially worked. That map worked for that scope up to a certain point, is that once we increase our knowledge, then we understand that in order to achieve that objective of a disease not spreading, there's more that we need to do. And we completely miss that if we stop at step one. If we map things in a certain way and it achieves that scope, or apparently it does, then it will not, by not gaining the complete knowledge of the problem, there will be certain complications that will come further down the road that we did not anticipate.
Yeah. So zooming out, I like to think about this theme as the archaeology of the future. So the idea that everything we're created right now, the data, the code, the patterns of how we interact online, one day they will become the artifacts, the cultural artifacts. So the future generations might study them the way we study ancient ruins. So if future archaeologists were to dig up our digital world, what do you think they'll find? What would be that archaeology of big data revelations? What would it show about us, like our anxieties, our obsessions, our values?
That is a fantastic thought exercise. And like archaeology in the United States, as far as I know, it's part of anthropology, while here in Europe it isn't. It's considered like a separate discipline. But again, like it's rightly included in anthropology, because then through archaeology we understand human behavior and cultures and evolution and so on and so forth. And it's a fantastic thought exercise to go and have this like imaginative time machine where we travel like centuries in the future. Like, what will these people think when they look back and they understand the age of AI, right? A similar thought experiment was created with the Silurian hypothesis, and by being myself a Doctor Who fan, I'm very fond of that thought exercise, where a bunch of years ago, in the field of astrobiology and anthropology, the fictional question of what if there was a very advanced technology based civilization millions of years back, way before the humans developed, and they may be like the Silurians in the Doctor Who show. Maybe there were aliens that inhabited Earth. How would we go finding out about it? And will we be capable of doing that? So we know that a bunch of millions of years ago, there was already enough fossil fuel sources to millions of years back in the past foster an industrial technology and society like ours. Now, the people that started this experiment, they did not really think that there was such a civilization. But what if? And trying to think, what should we be looking for? What will we find? And if we go on Mars or the moon, and we would try and find some artifacts that maybe the lack of atmosphere preserved way better than on Earth, or if we excavate, will we find something in the geological texture of planet Earth or others that would be a testimony of such a civilization? So they were starting thinking, what should we be looking for? What do we expect? And similarly, we could run the same kind of thought experiment where we go and think, way in the future, we'll look back, what will the archaeologists of the future find when it comes to AI? So in archaeology, you will have artifacts. You mentioned them, right? So there will be a bunch of things that the archaeologists will be looking for. There's the ecofacts and the artifacts and the features. So you're looking for either items that are being created by humans. So there will be artifacts. So things like, I don't know, a knife carved out of a stone, right? So be looking at tools and you go, oh, this is human made, right? Or then the archaeologists will be looking for features, the pyramids, like the known portable devices, let's say. We have that fingerprint, or we should say foot on Earth, where we know we can study past civilizations that way. And there's the ecofacts, so there will be impact on the environment that are not human created, but there are traces of human activities. Say, for example, have like a burn mark, and you know that there was a fire there. And in the plant of the house, that's where the fire was kept. So people were gathering around this fire. They were cooking. Maybe they were getting the family together around the fire. But there isn't anything that is showing us that there was a fire there in a prehistoric or a Viking home. But there are traces, burn marks, that will show us, oh, most likely there was a domestic fire here. So that's where the ecofacts come in place. So you got artifacts, objects, features like buildings, and ecofacts like traces that were left in the environment. So we try, maybe, like having this kind of thought experiment, we can try and think, what will be the artifacts, features, and ecofacts that in the future, the archaeologists of the future will find? What do you think? Maybe our viewers, listeners will start, wondering, saying questions. So you got artifacts, definitely laptops, smartphones, any sort of portable devices, VR glasses or AR glasses, and so on and so forth. So if we start asking ourselves the question, what are our artifacts? What are the items that we live with every day? That will start giving us an understanding of the kind of society we live in now. And then, you start thinking, wait a minute, is that always physical artifacts? If I generate a picture on ChatGPT, would that be an artifact? And would that be a human artifact, or would that be an AI artifact? Or would that be a mix of the two? But then again, you start thinking, okay, there's not only physical artifacts, there's also digital artifacts. And they may not be entirely human. They may be either generated by humans, so there's a creative value in your prompting. They may be coming from previous human work, and then again, we're going to the data training, and they be coming from an algorithmic elaboration. So the AI is taking your prompt, taking training material, and by working with the different ways that it has, or stable diffusion and before, it will create an image. And then again, you go, what are the features? Maybe massive data centers, energy draw with massive data centers. And
Yeah.
what will be the ecofacts, the impact on the environment of such massive data centers? So if you start thinking, I think that the best thing for our viewers and listeners to kind of like give value to this thought experiment would be, let me become an archaeologist. Let me think, I got artifacts, I got features, I got ecofacts. Let me try and put into these three boxes everything that is happening around us today. And that will give us certainly a much better sense of what is it that we're building, what is the kind of world that we're living in.
And as we continue building the systems, what kind of digital legacy are we leaving behind? So you mentioned the massive data centers, but what does it mean to design technology with that sense of future responsibility in mind, knowing that our algorithms might outlive us?
So you mean the kind of legacy that we're going to leave behind us, whether it's physical or information based, right? Or digital, right?
That's right. What would we want to leave behind to the future generations to study?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's not only a matter of what I would leave behind me or what we would leave behind us as things to study, but also the damage that we can create and the kind of stuff that people, the archaeologists of the future will have to leave by. So when it comes to damage, that the legacy that I don't want to leave, and that we should ask ourselves questions to avoid that would be mostly, at least for me, most importantly around environmental impact. So we're going into the ecofacts stage, right? So where you go, there's rare minerals that will go into deficiency because we've been massively using this for building our machines. There will be a lot of e-waste that will be left behind. There will be the environmental footprint of data centers. So if you start thinking this way, you go, oh, here is a legacy that we're leaving behind us. Do we want to leave that legacy behind us? Because if we don't want to, then we need to rethink some of these things. So then we need to mine the earth differently, leave less e-waste behind, and be mindful about the environmental impact of data centers. So that's a great way to go to start from a negative approach and go, this is the stuff that I don't want to leave behind. And for the positive approach instead, more on point to your question, what do we want to leave behind? And I think I would generally want to leave any form of culture, knowledge, information that is functional to a better human life and not dysfunctional in any way, especially to social relationship. So I would want to have, if we look at digital artifacts, something where the human footprint is visible, where AI is used as a tool that is complementary to human activity, that is less biased as it possibly can be, that is reflective of a multicultural point of view. So essentially touching all that we have said so far, I
Yeah.
would want the archaeologists to go and look at, we don't have a massive amount of content that is absolutely and utterly useless, that is biased and culturally blind and so on and so forth. I want the opposite of all of that to be able to be traced by archaeologists in the future. And again, this kind of thought exercise will have us thinking a little bit more about what we're doing today. And we don't want an archaeologist of the future to look at some AI-generated text and go, oh, humans were writing all the same way back in those days. Humans were disrespectful of this number of cultures because that AI content is not reflecting any of that. I think the most dangerous thing that we should be mindful of is that the archaeologists of the future, if we keep going down the wrong road, won't even be able to understand all of that. As in, if the archaeologist of the future is us a few generations further down the road, they will look back and they will not, or they may not have the tools to recognize that our production was culturally biased, or that our production actually degraded our language. It became a standard for everyone. So imagine that these archaeologists of the future are using AI themselves, are much poorer in terms of cultural understanding the language. When they look back, they may not be as evolved as we want them to be able to recognize all of this stuff. So we want to be very careful about the legacy that we're leaving behind us. Most importantly, to make sure that the archaeologists of the future will be smart enough to understand us.
Yeah, that's really fair.
Agreed. We need a lot more philosophy, human sciences, ethics, social sciences, behavioral sciences, psychology, you name them. We need a lot more human technology in a sense.
Yeah, here we are trying to augment ourselves without having a solid understanding what ourselves actually are.
Well, the thing is that we've been driving, or somebody else has been driving for us, this aggressive adoption of AI movements. With do we want to go and who do we want to become? Generally speaking, people really didn't care. And then in the AI years that we're going through now, people are starting thinking a lot more about ethics of AI. And so now it's becoming more interesting for many people. I think that still we need to also focus on much simpler things than AI, like the way we use instant messaging and WhatsApp, or the way we use a social networks messaging.
That's right. I mean, look, that your point about the Industrial Revolution and how it actually disrupted society and it pushed people into certain roles and ways of spending our days, and that really shaped the entire, in particular, Western society and the way we are today. And there are a lot of problems that arise at different cultural, psychological levels. People are asking themselves, like, what happened? Why, is the youth so miserable? Why, there are like groups of people who are feeling like we're disconnected from, what is a lot more natural to humans. And like this is the big part of the why, right? And so what you're saying is that you started this work over a decade ago, and we tend to have this knee-jerk reaction when there's like a big innovative exploration. But what you've been saying is like, hey, innovation is great, but can we think a little bit longer term and not just about the immediate gains? And I think we're speaking about the same things with slightly different angles. Like I always speak as sort of technology anthropologist, I always speak about the design behind the concept, behind the social movement, behind any innovative or any invention that might impact humans.
Absolutely. I think it's a even conversations like this are a great way to foster more interest around it and get people thinking. I know that we live in an age where there's a lot of fear when it comes to governance and compliance of AI. There's a massive gold rush, and we have seen it from the current U.S. administration, from other countries, from China, from many places around the world, where there's this fight between risk and opportunity, this idea of we need to be mindful about regulation because we don't want to stop economic growth or slow it down. And there's this like massive gold rush. Everybody's racing into this AI world, right? We know that the European Union has been taking a different approach with the EU AI Act, where there's a lot more emphasis on starting having some governance, which is coming from years of work, really. So I think in a way, the EU is leading the way towards a more mindful regulation and governance of AI. But in general, we want to ask ourselves questions. So as an anthropologist, you're looking at what is happening with technology. How does that impact human behavior? How does that change our views of the world? How does that change our culture? How are we evolving? And from an ethics standpoint, I'm looking into let's reason about how should we behave and why. So we want to drive a different behavior. We want to have long conversations and ask ourselves, what's the right thing to do? Because we're trying to shape that future archaeologists and anthropologists will study, and hopefully they will have something good to study instead of something bad. We mentioned industrial revolution and other examples, right? With technology moving faster. And in all of these examples, we're looking at disparity, inequity as a side effect, as the other face of the coin and the medal. So we need to ask ourselves questions around how is this impacting everyone? Who is left behind? Who is excluded from this? And the way we're operating, what damage is it causing? To also focus on the negative side of things. Like, let's look at the opportunities, let's look at the risks too. Let's try to have comprehensive point of view so that we're driving the right actions for everybody to be equally and justly impacted by this, directing certain informations or applying bias or being manipulative in a cultural sense or not being reflective of cultures in another sense, and so on and so forth. That wouldn't be very inclusive, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And very simplifying it, like philosophically, fast is not always better. More is not always better, and democratizing expectations and making them available for more people so they can make their own decisions and they don't feel like they're just getting pulled into many different directions. This conversation is as part of helping get to the future that we would want the future generations to discover and think positively about.
Agreed. And I will leave our listeners and viewers with this thought, especially as we develop some sort of algorithm approach to thinking, an algorithmic approach to problem solving. We are at risk of being influenced by AI way too much, where we're taking for granted some algorithmic decisions and responses, and we're simply repeating and applying what the AI is telling us. Or we've been so used with approaching problems in a certain way that we start thinking like a machine and we lose a part of the human. So the idea is really like when I talk to some friends of mine, sometimes we end up with conversations like, hey, do you want to come to this party? It happened to me, like real life example. Do you want to come to this birthday party? Like there's a bunch of friends that we have in common. It will be fun. And the answer I get from the other side is simply expand, as if it was a common prompt. And they're like, okay, I'm going to tell you more about this birthday party so you can decide if you want to join us or not. But that interaction is it's been for years that type of interaction really made it clear for me that there are two ways to pass the Alan Turing test so that it becomes impossible for us to recognize that we have a machine and not a human being in front of us. Either the machine becomes as good as a human, so that's the Turing point of view, like it's good at imitating the human thinking, or maybe the humans become a lot more like machines and we kind of like meet halfway. There's less work for the machines to perform and do to imitate humans if humans start thinking in a way that is much more similar to the machine. So I say, let's ask ourselves a lot of questions. That would be the key takeaway for our listeners and viewers.
That's great. Thanks so much, Angelo.
Thank you.